IORGCast, where we're going to discuss the question of why use email. We will examine whether we should and whether we can renounce email altogether, or maybe replace it with other communication tools or complement it with other tools. We will see. I'm Nathan Zeldes for IORG, and we have here two panelists, both famous for experimenting with going completely email-free for long periods, which are Lele Tirenzani and Luis Suarez, and I will let you introduce yourselves. So Luis, why don't you go first and tell us who you are and what your connection is to all this business of email and information overload.
Wow, okay. So, well, thanks a lot, Nathan and Lele, for having me on the show today. So my name is Luis Suarez. I'm originally born and raised in Spain. I live in the Canary Islands. Today is my 81st day in confinement. So it's kind of like an interesting context to talk about no email in a work environment where you don't rely on email anymore, right? So a little bit of background. So I used to work for IBM for 17 years. I left the company in 2014. And then I had my own business for 3 years. And now for the last 3.5 years, I'm working for a firm called Panagenda doing software analysis or data analysis of collaborative environments. So we're a software company, and we create different tools that help us understand how people collaborate the way that they do, right? And actually, it's interesting because one of the tools that we work with is email systems, right? So we help organizations understand how they use email or how they abuse email. And in the context for this conversation, and also going to Nathan's questions and comments, about 2008, so that's 12 years ago, I stopped using work email as my main resource of getting in touch with people, communicating, collaborating, et cetera. That was when I was at IBM. So I did it when I was at IBM for a number of years, when I was the 3 years on my own, so my own business, and I also now working for this other firm called Panagenda. In the context of why I don't use email, that all started as an experiment of trying to explore whether there were better, more effective ways of communicating and collaborating. And I suppose that the fact that I have done it for 12 years, I can confirm that you can live a life without email. It's a choice that we make, or we decide not to make. So hopefully in this conversation, we can explore why we should stop using it and what can we do about it, right? So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Lele, why don't you give us your story?
Okay. I mean, saying me famous compared to Luis, is too much in this case. I got really inspired initially directly from Luis, right? I'm still in IBM, but I remember many years ago when I was actually almost a newcomer, right? And I just didn't feel right to me, the email communication. It just didn't sound enough productive. And you enter into a company and they tell you this is how you should do it, right? This is how you should communicate. This is how the process works. And it didn't work so much. But I was seeing a lot of situations where it was much better to pick up the phone or to use another tool. And there was at the time early stage of Facebook, early stage of social networking, right? And then I met Luis. I had somehow we bumped in each other into some events where once I was co-facilitating, in another one I was just listening to his ideas, and I started thinking that it's possible to do something like that in a company. At that time I was working in finance, right? So I was a finance consolidator. Then I became manager, so I had a team. And I experienced the no email within a team. So I started, actually it's been 7 years I didn't use email, right? And then I moved to communications. So then actually the choice that I did many years ago to somehow work more on how I communicate brought me into the communication career. Because I had already some skills. It was background from university, but still my career was in finance before. And then I chose that, it's better to communicate in a different way. So I started making more videos and more graphics. Now I'm actually a video editor, communication leader for an area in IBM. And one thing that I figure out after a while, right, that might be also a point of conversation, is that my no email approach after 7 years worked only for me, but I was more like a rat laboratory dude instead of someone that was really advocating it for others. So everybody around me didn't really care. It was more like, yes, cool, you can do it, or like, I'm happy you're doing it, or like, you're a hero, you make it. But what I really wanted was not to prove that it's possible, but I wanted a more kind of homogeneous adoption inside the company, also maybe around people that are in contact with me, and this didn't happen. So I started thinking maybe there is another way instead of just no email. Is there another way to bring more adoption to it, right? So that's my story.
Very interesting. Well, you started answering our next question, which is, what did you learn from your no email experience? Which is one of our main purposes today, is to learn from what you guys did. Because I must say, I never went no email, but certainly I found both of you quite inspiring in this respect. It takes a lot of courage to do that. So let's hear from Luis. What did you learn from your experience as a no email user?
Well, it's been 12 years, right? So that means that I have learned a lot over the course of those 12 years. I should say that perhaps the thing that I have learned the most interesting for the purpose of the session is how if you have enough courage and bravery to challenge the status quo of how organizations work, you can pretty much get rid of email if you want to, right? What happens, and this is something that Lele mentioned as well, is that we have got this corporate culture so ingrained into our brains that we conform with the notion that in order for us to communicate and collaborate with people, we need to use email. Yes or yes. That's not true. That could have been maybe 40 plus years ago when email was the only thing available and it was just getting started and it was the only way of communicating digitally. But fast forward to 2020, we do have choices, and we do have lots of choices, right? Going back to something that Lele mentioned, in terms of what he considers his success, he may give the impression that he's failed because no one around him uses email. No, he's a huge success because he doesn't use email. The fact that we are on this session today without having sent a single email confirms to me that it can work, right? It all starts with the individual. That's one of the first things that I learned. If you truly believe that you want to get rid of email, you will find a way to get rid of email, right? So what happens is that it takes a bit of convincing, obviously, and persuading others. So eventually what you realize as you go through that journey is that if you want to make it work for you, it's relatively easy, because after all, you can negotiate with you how much you're going to use it. But if you then are going to work with a number of different people and you want them off email as well, that's when the negotiation starts, right? And that's when you need to basically help everyone understand how there are better ways. For me, the most effective way to prove that living a world or living a life without email works is when you actually demonstrate the benefits that you get from not using email, right? So to me, one of the things that I learned through all these years is that by not using email, I became a lot more open, public, and transparent in terms of my workload. So everyone knows, and I mean everyone in my close circles that I use email with, everyone knows what I work on a daily basis. Everyone knows what I do. Why? Because I expose it. I share it through various different digital tools, what I do. And that means that everyone knows what I'm working on, who I'm working with, what meetings I'm having, and everything else. So I expose myself. People may say, okay, so what's the benefit of doing that? Friction. You entirely get rid of frictions, which is one of the main issues with email. Email is all about private, opaque, obscure interactions where only a few benefit from it. But it's all about frictions. It's all about exceptions to the exception. It's about, how do you break up a process by sending an email, right? So when you remove those frictions, you realize that all of a sudden you have got so much more time that you can invest in doing something else, right? And that something else can be from helping your colleagues, talking to customers, share more proactively your knowledge, do more work in a particular area, or put yourself into a position where you want to learn about something new. So you eventually realize that your entire workload changes dramatically from being just having one single focal point of information and knowledge, which is your email box, into depending on much more open and transparent tools, right? And more collaborative tools. And eventually, I have always said that email is a very selfish tool because it only cares about you, nothing else, right? Whereas if you use these different collaboration tools that we're used to nowadays, like messaging and chatting apps or enterprise social networking tools, it's no longer about you. It's about everyone else. And that requires, and this is also one of my key learnings some of the years, is that it requires a mindset shift that most people are not ready for. Because on email, you have got the ability that or you have the feeling that you're in control, right? When actually you're not in control because everyone else can go into your inbox. And people feel like, well, if I release that sense of control that I think I have on email and I go to a space where it's about the we, not about the me, therefore I lose that ability to have control. And the notion there and the experience there is that this is not about how you control the workflow. This is about how you are part of the workflow. And being part of the workflow means that you need to let go. You need to understand that you benefit from the interactions and the conversations that you have with people, not necessarily how you actually handle your mailbox. And I know that a lot of people would tell you, yeah, but handling my inbox is really easy. And I would say, yes, it is, because it drives on efficiency. But I keep telling people, how effective are you? Because I do see a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. You can be very efficient and do inbox zero every day, but have you actually done work? Have you actually got your outputs and deliverables and everything else in a timely manner, right? In my experience, that's never the case. Why? Because we spend 4, 5, 6 hours every day doing email. It's a way of how we justify work. So one of the things that I learned as well, and I want to stop with that, is that email perpetuates what I have called for a long while now the cult of busyness. So people pretending to be busy when they don't do work, right? Whereas if you start exposing more of the work that you do and becoming more open, more transparent through all these of the different collaboration tools in the digital space, it's about effectiveness. It's not about how busy you are. So Lily, I don't know if that experience also matches some of your learnings over the years.
Yes, the switch from the tool as connected with that's the work I'm doing to the outcome, right, and the effectiveness of collaboration, I think is an important mindset switch that needs to be happening. I'm observing it now when there are many, the advent of this conversational tools like, I don't know, Slack or Microsoft Teams or WebEx Teams and so on, right? Still, they have the same kind of derailment factor where the majority of conversation, I could actually see the whole statistic, right? Still 90+% of all conversation appear in direct message, so private conversation one-to-one, while instead, if you really care for collaboration, you should have the majority of conversation in this kind of open channels, because then you don't have only your own inbox, your own communication, but everybody can benefit, even if they don't care. Right? The point is, you should make a little effort to say, maybe Nathan might want to know what me and you were sharing. So instead of just chatting me and you, we just bring Nathan into the chat and everyone can then read. Maybe Nathan doesn't care, okay, but if he cares, maybe there is one information and from there something can come. That's open collaboration. And
yeah, but if I can say that, and this is a good point, because you're basically demonstrating something there that is very difficult for people to grasp, and that is how we are not comfortable talking in the presence and working in the presence of others. So we don't like other people snooping around into what we do, right? And that's the reason why we use instant messaging. That's the reason why we use email, because there you can basically reduce the audience to those who you feel you're comfortable with, right? Now, that's a very silly attitude. That basically tells me that you do not trust your work, which is the worst thing that you can do, right? to showcase everyone else that you don't trust your work and therefore you don't want to show it. You don't want to narrate it, right? You don't want to work out loud, as it is well known for, right? And I think that is a very interesting point, because it then comes to question, what kind of work do you do that you don't want to share it? And I'm not talking about that you should share 100% of what you do, because that's impossible, right? But give me glimpses, and open glimpses that everyone else can benefit from, right? That anyone can go and say, wow, that was interesting. And then people tell me, yeah, but why should everyone be interested in what I share? I said, that's a silly question that you ask to yourself, because you should not be the one answering that question. The ones who read the stuff that you share are the ones who are going to question, what value does this bring to my interactions? If it brings value, I'll stick around. If it doesn't, I'll move on. It's that simple, right? That's the power of the conversation, the open conversation. And what I'm finding out is that a lot of people are terrified of having open conversations for everyone's benefit in an organization. I mean, and especially, when you work in relatively large organizations, it's even more prevalent, because people live on that knowledge is power mantra. So the more of my knowledge that I share, the more power that I give out. That's nonsense. If anything, is knowledge shared is power. The more that I share, the more that I'm making myself visible, and my skills and my expertise and the work that I do, the more influential I become. Why? Because people will get to know who I am. That's
It
simple.
becomes even more tricky when you get leadership in it. Like when you get the leader, so you do something for the leader, so you have the secret conversation, and then you share to the leader the final outcome, instead of just putting everybody into the same place. So you have the goal, the guidance, the ongoing, the project, and then the delivery exactly in the same place, right? So that's even more complex if you bring that.
Yeah, but I mean, Nathan had a comment, so I'm gonna let Nathan, because one of the leaders is on a different game, and I'll explain to you what I mean with that.
Yeah, and much of what you say resonates well with me from my days at Intel. Everything about the mistrust and all that, believe me. But I have one question here, which is, much of what you say goes to collaboration in teams. Now, I've been working actually on bringing team collaboration tools into Intel in the late 90s, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And for teams, it makes great sense. Team decides to use Slack. Everybody uses Slack for the project of the team. And you don't have to convince me that it's going to make them more productive. But then there is the 1,000 other people that each of them communicates with, which are not in the same team and maybe not in the same company. And how does their going no email tie into those other people, which either only use email or are not on their Slack tool or whatever? Can you look at that wider scope for a moment?
Yeah. So what happens there, and Lele, I'll go to you back to the leaders. Don't worry, because you bring in a very good point in there as well. So what happens is that a lot of organizations, and what I mean with a lot of organizations is a lot of people do not understand that there used to be a mantra that was that one size fits all, right? That was that's what email used to do, right? One tool for everything, right? And then obviously we enter the space of enterprise social networking tools around 2004, 2005, and they still had that mantra, one size fits all, right? So you only needed one of these platforms to do the work, right? What most people don't seem to understand is that we humans do lots of very different things at work. And therefore, we have got different context and different needs at one given point, which means that we're going to be using different tools at any given point in time, right? So yes, there is a need for tools that allow for the one-on-one interactions when you're, for instance, sharing confidential content. If you're sharing highly confidential content, you may not want people to stick around and snoop around onto what you're sharing, right? And then what Nathan mentioned about the need for those team spaces where you have got a lot more intimate, fast-paced, back and forth, smaller groups of 4 people working on project work, where they get together and they do all of that work and they decide hey, we need to have a Slack space. Let's go and do it, right? That's perfect. What a lot of people are missing is that there are 2 more layers on top of that. And that is the one about communities of practice, right? Where you basically no longer have that constraint of trapping a particular group space. Communities of practice with community members that come and go, right? It's a community of volunteers, right? And that's when you enter the enterprise-wide collaboration, which by default is to open interactions, not private. The team space is private, like instant messaging, like email, and it can be very limited in terms of value, right? What you're looking for is also the combination with the enterprise-wide collaboration, right? And that's essentially done through communities of practice. And then there's the larger space, which is networks, when the entire organization transforms itself into a cluster of networks. So groups of people who get together, who are connected with one another, who basically learn from one another on different tools or through different social tools, and they have the ability to basically say that their passion, excuse me, their passion is a topic that they're interested in. Not necessarily that they belong to a particular project team, or they're working in a particular division, or they work with a particular group of people. They're actually truly passionate about wanting to connect and network with other people because they share a common passion, a common topic of interest. I think that when you put that in context, then you realize that you start challenging the core nature of how work happens, because it's no longer about the one-on-one small group or private siloed kind of interactions. It's also the enterprise-wide communication and collaboration that happens through some of these social tools. And people tell me like, yeah, hang on, but with email, I'm going to have to go to one place. I know you are telling me that I need to go to 4 or 5 places. Yeah, what's wrong with that? And I explain with what I mean with that. Over the course of the 12 years, I've done a lot of research in terms of that no email journey and what other people were doing and what other organizations were doing, and also how our brains work. And our brains actually, apparently, according to scientific research, we respond better in fragments than when we see things as a whole, right? That's why we don't like the email box, because it's just one single hole that everything happens. When you fragment into a tool suite, how you collaborate and why you collaborate with the specific groups, we become a lot more effective actually, because we put on one hat and we know that we do that, then we put the other hat and we know that we do that, and we know exactly.
And perhaps many consider these fragments are their email folders, right?
Yeah, which is not true, because it all goes to the same inbox folder first before you move it into the folder, right? And that means that, and actually, a good friend of mine, Bill French, quoted this sentence, which was, email is where knowledge goes to die. In 1999, over 21 years, right? And then people tell me like, oh yeah, that's because you always advocate about these social tools and everything else. I said, no, there have been people before me, in 1999 who were saying, email is not where you go and share your knowledge, because that's where it goes to die, right? And the whole notion of that is that if you look into the context of the field of knowledge management, right, email is the worst system to capture and retain your knowledge. Why? Because only you sees it, no one else. And the moment that you leave organization, the moment that the organization loses thousands of documents, thousands of conversations, thousands of contacts, thousands of interactions, that's all gone, like boom. And when you have got hundreds, if not thousands of employees who over the course of the years leave an organization, that's corporate knowledge, that's critical knowledge that the organization no longer has. So they're crippling. Every time that someone uses an email, they're crippling themselves, literally. Why? Because it only benefits them, and the organization just fails. And then people tell me like, well, I don't care about anyone else. I only care about my work. That's a very selfish
challenge that, because I think there are really many layers and dimensions here. But so some of my communication, for instance, my communication with you, I would use LinkedIn Messenger because we don't do email. Yes, that information is lost to your organization as well.
Yeah.
So, and still you say the LinkedIn Messenger is better than email. And that may be right, but it is unrelated to the argument about retaining knowledge in an organization. Completely unrelated to that.
Right, but if you look into it, the way we interact, for instance, on the example that you mentioned about the LinkedIn messaging, I'm not showing any critical knowledge in there. I'm just basically confirming with you, we're going to meet up on this date, on this time. Here's the Zoom link. Here are the questions. Let's go and talk. That's not critical knowledge. That's something very concrete that happened.
Yeah.
We will not share the recording on a LinkedIn direct messaging, will we? That's the critical knowledge. A lot of people will go and say, here's my presentation slides and here's the attachment and everything else, or here's, the recording itself if it is not too large video or whatever. So I think what happens there is that with email, we don't stop to think about what we consider transitional knowledge and critical knowledge. I'm okay with the transitional knowledge to let it go. Why? Because it's impossible to capture the thousands or millions of interactions that we do on a daily basis across the organization, right? But I'm interested in retaining the knowledge that I know is going to be valuable to other people in the organization.
With a good search engine, you can really find
it's not a problem. And not even with a good search engine, if you actually build an organization where you have got a network environment with communities, the challenge is not where to find information, is where to ask the question about where you can find information. That's the beauty about networks, right? And frankly, for instance, in the topic, for instance, of trying to find an expert, it's a lot harder finding an expert via email than on an open network, where you can ask a question and say, hey, who can help me in this particular field? And if you have a network that you have nurtured over the course of the years, and I remember back on my IBM days, I had 4,000 people in my network. I literally reached anywhere in the 600,000 organization that it was at the time in a matter of minutes. If I were trying to find that kind of expertise via email, it would be a total failure. A total failure. Why? Because I would only know my close network, my 1 or 2 or 3 people that I interact with, and then they will have to go through their own, and then their own, and their own, and it will be a week before I find my experts.
So I will ask you a question now. So what this leads to is that ideally we should have a kind of decision tree or tool or something that would examine, is this kind of message that you're about to send an organizational knowledge kind of message or a transactional one-on-one or whatever, and direct you to use the right tool for it. It's not one tool fits all. So my question to you is, does email have a place on that decision tree? Is there some kind of messages where email as we know it is going to be the tool of choice, or is email destined to be killed completely because it's good for nothing compared to other tools?
Okay, so maybe I should explain the 3 use cases for which I still use email 12 years later. Yeah, there are 3 use cases for which I still use email. And for me personally, there's no other excuse as to why you will use email beyond those 3 use cases. Like I said before, in 12 years' time, it gives you a lot of time to learn what is good for, what is not good for, and everything else, right? So number 1 use case is a universal identifier. So whenever you sign up for a new service, or you get your flight tickets and everything else, they always ask you for an email. Nowadays, there are a lot of services that
going
ask
as
you.
well, right?
Yeah, that's going as well, because a lot of people ask for a mobile number, right? So you get it on your mobile phone because we are mobile first, right? But it's pretty much used as a universal identifier still, although it's fading, right? So that's use case number 1. Use case number 2: calendaring and scheduling. So you use email to send the calendar invite when you want to meet with people, right? I haven't found, there used to be tools about 10 years ago. There used to be actually a really powerful tool that did all of that without email, which was phenomenal, and unfortunately died. I haven't seen any other tool that does this well, right?
Events,
So
like
eventually,
Facebook
the setting up of the meeting, and then send it to a bunch of people or whoever, that still is a very good use case. And the third use case is when you want to have a traceable and auditable one-on-one confidential conversation with the other party. So essentially, when your HR department sends you your payslip, you don't want to share that, obviously, right? So you use that one-on-one confidential exchange, right? Anything else, there's no excuse that it cannot be moved elsewhere, right? So from going to Nathan's question about where does it fit on that flow chart about what I need to do, essentially, in my flow chart, it's not even showing up there. And people would tell me, okay, does that mean that you are 100% on no email? Seriously, no. I get about 7 emails per week of people who refuse to use anything else than email. That's where it shows on my flow chart. When with the people that I'm interacting with, when they don't want to use any other tools, when they don't want to use phone calls, instant messaging, chatting, messaging, collaboration, enterprise social networking, community of practice, group spaces, or whatever, and they say, I only and nothing else than email, that's what I use with them. Why? Because it's my only means to communicate with them. You may say, okay, but that means that you're still going to use email. I say, yeah, 7 a week. Right now, I'm averaging 7 emails a week. So that's 1 a day, literally, right?
Many in our audience eat their hearts out now.
They may, but the thing is that, over the course of, and this is one of the things that happens once to me, it happened that once I started seeing the light of what it was like not being put together to the yoke of email in terms of liberating myself from that yoke. Once you see the light, there's no way back. There's no way back. I worked in a very large organization, IBM, and I did that from 2008 to 2014. I did 3 years of my own business. And then people tell me like, yeah, you were doing that at IBM because it was easy. You had the tools, you had the technology because it's an IT company, blah, 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 blah. So I say, okay, well, now I'm on my own. I have got my own business. I live in the Canary Islands. I work with all over the Europe and as well in the US and so forth. And I still don't use email. I still use other tools, right? I then joined Pen Agenda, where I work with a group of folks that are team members scattered all over the planet, running different geographies, and I don't use email either, right? And the notion there is that, and this is maybe the message for the audience is challenge yourself if you really, really, really want to get rid of email. It's nice words if you say, "Oh, I wish I could kill it." That doesn't work to me anymore. If you don't do anything about it, if you don't challenge the way you work, if you don't challenge the status quo, if you don't sort of like question to yourself, am I being the most effective that I can be with the tools that I have at my disposal? You're talking nonsense. Stop the talking. Start doing. And here's the thing. A lot of people tell me, yeah, but I don't know if I'm gonna be that radical of going no email. Well, go less email. That works with me. Why does it work with me less email? Because I know that the moment that you let it sink in a little bit, the moment that you start seeing the cracks on the wall about how you start using so much email, then you realize, actually, I can move these use cases away from email and move it into elsewhere. So you only need to have, I tell people in terms of practical methodology that moving away from email is trying to identify what kind of an emailer you are, right? Are you the person who answers questions or who asks questions, who shares project status reports, who shares news items, who starts conversations, who finds experts via email? So we basically have to figure out what kind of emailer we are, right? So each of these actions that I just mentioned now, they're use cases, right? So what you can do is you can group those use cases, and then you can see, where could I move these use cases within my organization? In the sense of what else can I use as opposed to email? And nowadays we move in environments, even within the academic world, where we do have choices. We do have digital tools in place, whether they are team spaces, collaboration spaces as in messaging and chatting, whether it's enterprise social networking tools, whether it's virtual meeting tools, whatever it is, right? We do
Many
have
are
those
free,
choices, right?
right?
And a good number of them are relatively free, right? And are relatively free because a lot of them live on the freemium model, right? But they're there, right? And it's actually, this is an investment that you make in the future. And once you do that, then that's when you start doing that transition from the old way of working to the new way of working. And always what I tell people as the third most important pillar is to justify to yourself individually the benefit that you get from it, right? So by doing this, what do you gain, right? And then this is the magic. It's a start with one of those a week. So an example, and I'm going to use one example that everyone can relate to. We all share files via email. If you work for me, I will kill the attachment icon, I tell you, because it's the most pernicious icon on an email box, right? The attachment. But we all send files, right? So the use case, the old way of working is use email to send files. Okay, the new way of doing that is don't share the attachments via email and look into file sharing applications like Google Drive, like OneDrive, like SharePoint, like Box, like Dropbox. Choices. I've given you 5 choices already, right?
Hey, no,
Share your files there.
I have
You
to
go ahead.
interrupt you and point out that that's not a new way. I was pushing for that in the 90s when SharePoint came in. So it's the inertia of people that makes it still seem new because they haven't yet fully adopted it.
True, and you're absolutely right, Nathan. And the reason why I'm mentioning new is because of what you said. But if you look into it, now that with the pandemic, with COVID-19, everyone is being forced to work from home, and they're not used to using these digital tools because they have never used them, despite the fact that they have been there for years, right? And to them, it's all new. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know that I could do all of these things. And we go like, hang on, I've been using blogs and wikis and stuff since the early 2000s.
Mm.
And like, where have you been the last 2 decades, people? You know? So the whole thing there is like I said before. So you identify the old behavior, sharing files via email. Then you have the new behavior, which is using one of those options that I mentioned earlier on. And then the personal benefit for me that I translated was that I was no longer using email and getting in mail jail, stuck in mail jail when people exceeded blowing up my mailbox by sending attachments far too large, far too big. So eventually, what did I do? I just moved it all away. So I moved all of my attachments, and then people would send me, "Can you send me that presentation?" I will tell them it's actually on my files in this particular place. And if you can't find it, I'll send you the link. Send you the link. Share the link. Right? The content is stored elsewhere. So the interesting thing here is that when you actually build those use cases, only after a few short weeks, 5 weeks, that's a methodology that I use, you can actually reduce about 80% of your email load.
Or even more. Yeah, that's true.
In 5 weeks, right?
So
who's not going to want to do that?
What I found as trouble here, right, is that it worked for me, right? It worked always for me. And I usually kept always the redirecting conversation through email, from email through something else. So I got the mail, my reply was somewhere else, right? Man, that's okay. Yeah. But I found a lot of stubbornness in many situations, right? So, for example, I had a boss that even if he knew my whole kind of mission or whatever, kept replying me or sending me mails regardless for what was my preference. I even did weekly mentoring, like 1 hour every week, showing different collaboration tools, showing the reasons for it, showing videos and content. No way, right? People in the same way is the same. So if you have a group and you say, okay, this group, let's use from now on, we have a Slack channel, let's all talk there. We have box where all the files are present. You have perhaps a Trello as well, where you can see the progress of your whole thing. Very nice. But then one start not understanding it and sends the mail, and then other, wow, there is the mail again, and they get on it, right? So what I found as a struggle is, it's like, is it so hard? And maybe it is for many to really adopt this behavioral change to get somewhere else. Tools seems easy, but there are a lot of ideas. Like, Facebook is only for my private life, and Slack, yes, but I don't know how to log in. My mobile, I don't remember the password. So okay, I just have the mail, right? So Trello, okay, but where is the notification? Where do I get it? How can it work? And everyone has the same count, 7 years, 8 years of the same kind of pattern over and over and over. No matter how many hours I spent in training and delivering videos and so on, right? So where is the problem? Maybe the problem is in the tools. I don't know.
No. The problem is in one of the keywords that you mentioned when you were sharing that, which is stubbornness. They have been more stubborn than you have been. You have given in. You eventually decided, at one point in time, you decided to stop feeding the beast, which is basically use email. So you stopped doing that. But when you saw that your colleagues were still stubborn and they still came to email, eventually you gave in, eventually you gave up, and eventually you continued using email because they were using email. That's the thing that you didn't do right. That you need to be more stubborn than they are, right? So the example that you mentioned about your manager, do you think that your manager is going to fire you for stopping using email?
No, that has never been
So
a problem.
why continue to use email? You know what happens in
but
there. No, hang on. What happens in there? Let me say this. What happens in there is that there's also with the use of email. There's also the power struggle. People exert power by how they abuse email, especially managers and leaders. Right? They prefer to manage people in a controlled environment to them where only they and the other person sees the interaction versus everyone else. So for them to move into elsewhere, there's no incentive at all whatsoever. Why? Because they're exposed, right? Because everyone will know what a great manager they are or what a really bad manager they are, right? And obviously that's something that no one wants to show in that case, right? But what happens in the experience that you mentioned there, Lele, is that you eventually gave up. I mean, I had that situation when I was at IBM, right? I had that at points when I was doing and running my own business. What happens is that I was basically at the point where I was telling people, you know, if you need my knowledge, that's how I place. It's negotiation, right? And the idea was that but you know it's so much easier for these interactions to take place on email. I said yes, they are for you, but not for everyone else, because everyone else does not have your knowledge and my knowledge, so everyone else loses, right? So the whole idea here is that you need to persevere. You need to be more stubborn than they are, right? And at one point in time, it clicks. I cannot tell you the time frame because people are different and they have got different habits and mindset and behaviors. But at one point in time, it clicks, right? What I do know is that if you don't persevere, if you're no more stubborn than them, you eventually will be eaten by the beast. Why? Because it's easier for them to manage an environment that they know than to explore something that they don't know. And frankly, you know, I know, you know, from our mutual years at IBM, I know that you did a lot of work around enablement and showing people how it works and everything else. I did that fair share as well. That's not going to go away because a lot of people are very set on their ways, and you need to show them that there's a different way, right? The key message there is don't give in, don't conform. It's actually the way I describe this is as well in terms of when younger generations come into the workplace, right? Younger generations, typically, they don't use email themselves. They use everything else, right? But when they come to the workforce and they come to the workplace and they start saying that their senior colleagues and senior, not necessarily like in their really old, but, you know, they have been in the company for a number of years already, right? They see that they all use email. So what did they do? They conform. What did they do? They all use email. What did they do? They all buy into using email because my colleagues are using email. Versus saying, hey, stop using email. None of us or the younger generations uses email because we know that there are better choices out there. They don't say that. Why? Because they want to conform. They don't want to be seen as the outliers, as the outcasts, as the troublemakers and everything else. And yeah, they conform with an obsolete way of working that was there from the 1970s. Hello, let's move into the 21st century, please, right? Our mindset needs to move into the 21st century, which we haven't, right? So the thing is, Lele, you may be saying, okay, yeah, but I still have got the challenge with you know my manager and the people that I interact with and everything else. Stop feeding the beast. You know, if you tell people this is the only place where you can find me, if they need you, they will find you there. If they don't need you, they won't. But if they do, they know where to find you.
And that's true. That's true. That's what happens, right? If they need me, they find me there, and that's okay. They know where to find. They call me and so. But then it becomes I'm more of a problem, right? And I thought it would be like, okay, you wait 1 year or 2 years, and eventually it splits and it clicks. But in reality, it's still like now there are many of my colleagues and peers that have two ways of communication. One is with the team, and one is, oh, let me share also with Lele, right? So I am kind of
Yeah, but
somewhere.
let me tell. Yeah, but so it may give you the impression that you're the outsider. But let me ask you: in the long run, who benefits the most from one way interacting or the other way of interacting?
Oh yeah, that's another point. But
Right. Well, it is the point. I mean, what happens is what I'm trying to say here is that those folks who say this is how we communicate and this is how we communicate with Lele, those folks are saying this is the selfish me who only cares about me. I don't care about who I share, what I share, and where impact it has in the organization. Whereas on the other side is I do care who I share with this because this is also going to be beneficial for the large organization when I'm gone. Right? A lot of people don't think about that. A lot of people only think about, yeah, I only care about my mailbox because that's the only thing that I need to do for work. I say, yeah, but what happens when you're not there? What happens when you're on vacation? What happens when you're off sick? What happens when you're in a customer workshop on training or whatever? And no one can reach to you because you're using your email. And no one has our access to your email. And what happens when your mailbox gets deleted when you leave the company and you lose thousands and thousands of documents and information and contacts and conversations? Like, who is doing the wrong job here? Because it may give you the impression that you are the weird one, you are the outcast, you are the one, the black sheep, because you're working different than everyone else. So yeah, that may be true, but who's going to have a long-term impact versus just that short term for as long as my inbox runs, right? I mean, I still have got colleagues, and you know this because for that you're one of them. I still have got colleagues after I left IBM 6 years ago that still tell me, oh my God, I remember the good fun times when we were sharing all of this content and we created these knowledge management repositories and we were using different technologies to collaborate and build networks. This is 6 years ago when I left the company, right? Can I say the same thing for people who were using email? No. Why? Because they don't leave any legacy. No one can see that legacy. No one can see the work that you have done, the people you have helped, the connections that you have built, the work that you have done. If people don't want to have a legacy, fine, be my guest. But I don't know about you guys, I want to be remembered when I'm gone for doing something or for having done something, because otherwise my life is useless and worthless if no one remembers me. They say that you die twice, right? The one that you die, and then when someone mentions your name's the last.
Luis, don't worry. We remember you well.
No, but this is what happens. This is the dynamic. This is. I mean, the way for me I started this no email journey, there were different motivations in terms of lack of productivity and abuse and abuse as in people abusing the tool, right, as a delegation machine and dumping you their work and everything else. And then eventually, over the course of the years, I realized that the change was a lot more profound. That it was a change in terms of how I view work life, in terms of how, for me, email is a very powerful tool to instigate corporate politics and bureaucracy and bullying and power struggles. And you realize that when you work in a different way with no using email, you let all of that behind. Why? Because you expose yourself. You become a lot more open and transparent. And then you realize that you are truly understanding the notion of collaboration, of working together with people versus fighting people, which is eventually what happens through email, right? And that's when you realize that the whole nature of work is on a completely different game. It's just that mindset shift that tells you work is actually fun. When was the last time that people were saying that work is fun?
It is fun.
That you were looking forward to come to work every day to do 100, 200, 300 emails.
I remember those days, actually. We didn't have email. We had brown envelopes. 1 hour a day of doing that, and the rest of the day was fun. And I hear that from many old timers that work used to be more fun. Let me now do this. Let me give you the last question I want to discuss today, which is what next? So it's not only is email itself evolving, but is email even going to be replaced by a different communication paradigm? And I don't mean that we're going to have a better version of Slack. I mean completely different. For example, one paradigm that didn't make the grade, but that was raised at some point was, should we have an email standard where the emails destroy themselves after a time, either set by the sender or by some other methods? That's a different paradigm. What other paradigms do you foresee in our future? Let's start with Lele, and then we'll have Liz close the day on that question, and we'll be done. Lele.
I mean, I don't see much of a change in email except for becoming more and more just a notification part. So I expect that there would be more tools that would show email like a social network, maybe just automatically grouping, so there is a bit of AI in it, so that you're able to use it much more also as notification for all those cases and all those, because the transition will take long, right, before getting to only mobile or on getting on social network. But what would be really the killer of email would be something like a universal social network, something that is not Facebook or LinkedIn, but is something that is above all. And that's where you can log in and link with everything else, right? Until then, I think the email will stay for time being, and will be still more and more, losing power into direct messaging, right? And into kind of private group conversations.
Thank you.
Okay.
Liz, what do you think?
So on my very optimistic days about email, I think that machine learning is going to save it, right? I feel that, I don't know if you would agree with this point of view, but the way I see people interacting with email is very automated. As saying, receive the email, reply right away. Not even think about what you replied, right? And in most cases, you go and end up doing standard replies with standard responses. So one of the things that I'm really excited about on my positive days about email is that machine learning is going to eat all of that. And it's actually going to have machines interacting with machines to respond to those email messages from humans. So the humans are freed up to do much more creative work. You cannot be creative on email. I'm sorry. And if people tell me that they are very incredibly creative doing email, they're lying through their nose, because we all know that we cannot be creative using a constrained environment as email is, right? So my big hope is that machine learning will take over and will actually help us understand that email still can be used as a communication tool. And Lele, you are actually anticipating what it will be like, which is becoming an alert or a notification system of content that is stored elsewhere. Funny enough, in the 1970s, that was the main purpose of email. It was only like in the 90s when they started using attachments and MIME and everything else that it became a content repository. But before that, it was an alert and messaging system. So the future of email is go back to the past, to 40 years ago, right?
Right.
On the other hand, I think that one of the things that is going to be very interesting for email is how it needs to blend into the reality of people working with different contexts, right, and different groupings. And depending on what you want to do, you can interact with one another, which is why you see, I mean, you were talking about something that sits on top of the social media tools and social tools that we have now, right? That's called federation of social networking tools. That's actually the only reason why email is alive today. That a lot of these tools, they don't talk to one another, right? And there are multiple reasons why that happens, right? But the thing is that a lot of people now understand that because they use all of these tools now, because they have diversified, they have fragmented, they're starting to demand more integration between these different tools, right? When that integration takes place, when it becomes a federation, email is pretty much dead, because the only protocol that saves email right now is that it's universal to everyone. Everyone has got an email address, right? We will have that universal identity, right, on the digital space. That's eventually coming up. Like what shape, what form, I don't know yet, but we will have it. And at that point in time, email will be pretty much dead. The other hope that I have, and I'm not saying that we're going to kill email, I think that it's going to stop being used. It will be considered obsolete, right? And if you look into it, the younger generations, they're starting to become a lot more people in the workforce than the older generations, right? because obviously the older generations, they retire, and the new generations, they come on to work. And then before we were talking about millennials, as you guys remember, millennials are now 40-year-old people. So they're not really that young anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to start thinking about those other generations in their 30s, in their early 20s that are starting to enter the workforce and who basically say, well, if I have got a way now of using tools and not using email, boy, I'm going to use these tools. And they're already using it. And because before they were not in the majority, they were conforming. But now they are in the majority. Mm-hmm. So they will be ruling the workplace. And email is not going to be the tool that they're going to rule with, right? And like I said before, I think that we will see technology for email evolve into the machine learning space. I'm not going to use artificial intelligence because we're not there yet, but machine learning in terms of helping automate a lot of the interactions that are happening now so that we've freed up the time. But at the same time, I think that there's going to be a mindset shift from those younger generations that are going to push over the limit and are going to tell people, hey, it's time to get your act together and move into the 21st century, right? Yeah. With all of this, what I'm saying is that we're going to see a transition into a different operating model within the workforce. Like I said before, email is a very powerful tool to communicate in small groups, teams, where you have got hierarchical structure, right? But when you move into an operating model that is networks and communities, email is useless. Why? Because it cannot scale. It cannot scale into the hundreds or thousands of conversations that can happen every day on a massive network, right? Or in a community of practice of 500,000 people. Whereas on using some of these social tools is a no-brainer, right? So I think that as that operating model consolidates into the workforce, well, as we move into more networks and communities as the operating models, email has got its days numbered. I mean, I'm living that world, and 12 years later, I get 7 emails a week. I'm living into the future of everyone else. Seriously. When I tell people I get 1 email a day, they look like, excuse me, like, are you all right? Do you need any kind of mental help? I said, no, that's your reality in a few years when you click. I already did 12 years ago, right? And this is what is going to be really fascinating, because when we do that, we will start truly challenging the nature of how work happens today. And it will transform itself. We will transform it. And you know what? This pandemic, the COVID-19, has been the key accelerator to tell people that there are more effective ways of working than meetings and email. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the consequence is that we burn out. And we fatigue, and we're tired, and we're exhausted of being all the time through email, through Zoom meetings, and everything else. We're learning through the hard trial and error of saying that this is not a way of working in a digital world. And we will be working in a digital world. It's just a matter of when, right? And COVID just accelerated the whole process.
Yeah. Well, actually, when you're talking about machine language and all that, that does bring us to my old joke, which is what we should have is 2 AI systems sending email to each other and letting us go do other things. So maybe we're going to get there.
We will get there. An interesting question, Nathan, there, which and this is an open question to everyone who listens to this conversation and everything else, is what are we going to do when we free up all of that time? What kind of work would we want to do? That's what I find really fascinating.
We'll manage. Well, folks, I think we had a very interesting conversation here today, actually.
Oh, yeah.
And I will conclude it. I want to thank you guys for sharing your experience, which is highly unusual, and your insights, which are deep, with the entire IORG audience out there. And I wish you and them and everyone good health and good productivity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having us. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye for now.